The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, stands as one of the most decisive and expansive naval engagements in world history, not only because of its immense scale, but also because of the enormous strategic weight it carried in determining the future course of the Pacific War. As the United States and its allies prepared to liberate the Philippines, a moral, political, and logistical priority for General Douglas MacArthur, Japan found itself compelled to resist with every remaining ounce of its naval strength. The Philippines were the lifeline that connected the home islands to the vital natural resources of Southeast Asia. To lose them would mean the severing of oil, rubber, and raw material supplies essential for Japan's war machine. Thus, the Japanese High Command, already weakened by catastrophic losses at Midway and the Marianas, and reeling from dwindling fuel reserves and shortages of trained aviators, made the desperate decision to commit nearly every available warship in a massive multi-pronged counterattack they believed could drive the Americans from the archipelago. What followed was a chaotic, sprawling four-part encounter: Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Cape Engaño, and the Battle off Samar, each of which showcased different elements of naval warfare, from carrier airstrikes to battleship gunnery, from submarine ambushes to the unexpected heroism of small escort carriers and destroyers standing against vastly superior forces. Yet, what makes the battle so compelling is not just the ships involved or the tactics employed, but the immense strategic gamble undertaken by the Imperial Japanese Navy in what would become its last major operation. For Japan, Leyte Gulf was a final effort to reverse the tide, a last-ditch attempt to split the U.S. fleet, annihilate its invasion forces, and restore at least the possibility of negotiating from a position of strength. For the United States, it was the culmination of a relentless island-hopping campaign that had carried the Navy across the Pacific, forging a new era of carrier-based power that had rendered Japan's surface fleet, and even its battleships, dangerously outdated. The introduction of the Fast Carrier Task Force, the effective integration of submarines into fleet operations, and the rapid wartime rise of American industrial capacity meant that by 1944 the U.S. Navy possessed not only superior ships and aircraft, but also overwhelming logistical momentum. The Japanese, in contrast, entered Leyte Gulf suffering from oil shortages so severe that some ships were able to sail only because they siphoned fuel from others. Many of their newer aircraft were flown by barely trained pilots, and their once feared carrier force was reduced to hollowed-out platforms used more as sacrificial decoys than as offensive weapons. Still, in their determination to defend the Philippines, they crafted a bold and highly complex plan, Surigao I, intended to lure Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the San Bernardino Strait by using their nearly empty carriers as bait, while their center and southern forces slipped through narrow waterways to crush the American invasion fleet off Leyte. The plan depended on perfect timing, luck, and the assumption that American commanders would react precisely as expected. What unfolded over 3 extraordinary days was a battle defined as much by confusion and miscommunication as by courage and firepower. In the Sibuyan Sea, the Japanese super battleship Musashi, one of the largest and most heavily armored warships ever built, was subjected to a relentless series of airstrikes by American carrier aircraft, ultimately succumbing to torpedoes and bombs that overwhelmed even her colossal hull. At Surigao Strait, American battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor participated in the last line of battle engagement in naval history, crossing the T of the Japanese Southern Force in a dramatic and one-sided night action. Off Samar, the vastly outgunned escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy III fought with such ferocity and audacity that they managed to repel the powerful center force under Admiral Kurita in what became one of the most heroic defensive actions in U.S. naval history. And at Cape Engaño, Admiral Jesuburo Ozawa's depleted carriers were effectively sacrificed, their destruction marking the symbolic end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an offensive fighting force. The outcome of Leyte Gulf sealed Japan's fate. Its navy, once the spearhead of expansion across Asia and the Pacific, was rendered incapable of mounting further large-scale operations. American control of the seas around the Philippines ensured the success of the Leyte landings and paved the way for the liberation of the archipelago, the eventual cutting of Japan's supply lines, and ultimately the advance toward Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands themselves. Yet beyond these strategic outcomes, the battle remains a symbol of the dramatic transformation of naval warfare in the 20th century. Leyte Gulf represented the passing of an era in which battleships dominated the seas, replaced by the ascendancy of carrier aviation and submarine warfare. It also reflected the human dimensions of conflict: courage, desperation, miscalculation, sacrifice, and resilience on both sides. American sailors aboard small escort carriers and destroyers demonstrated extraordinary bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, while Japanese crews fought with grim resolve even as their fleet crumbled around them. The battle's complexity, its massive geographic scope, and the decisive shift in naval power it represented have made it a subject of enduring study. Historians continue to debate the decisions of leaders like Halsey, Kurita, and Ozawa, dissecting the miscommunications that shaped the battle's outcomes and exploring how chance, weather, reconnaissance errors, and human judgment intersected in critical moments. But despite such debates, the significance of Leyte Gulf remains unquestioned. It was the battle that broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy, ensured the success of the American return to the Philippines, and marked a major turning point in the global struggle for the Pacific. In many ways, Leyte Gulf stands as the climactic naval confrontation of World War II, a sprawling and complex event whose echoes, strategic, technological, and human, continue to resonate in the story of modern warfare. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive turning point. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once a formidable force capable of rapid territorial expansion across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, was now heavily depleted by years of attritional warfare. The setbacks at Midway, the grinding losses of the Solomon Islands campaign, and the steady erosion of Japan's carrier and pilot strength had drastically weakened its strategic posture. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies had been building unprecedented momentum across multiple fronts, driving Japan back island by island. For Allied strategists and political leaders alike, the question was no longer whether Japan could be defeated, but how quickly and decisively it could be done. In this environment, the Philippine Islands, occupied by Japan since early 1942, emerged as a central objective. Their liberation promised not only a major psychological blow to Japan, but also the severing of critical supply routes feeding its embattled forces throughout the region. General Douglas MacArthur had long envisioned the Philippines as the key to cracking Japanese defenses in the Western Pacific. His dramatic escape from Bataan and Corregidor in 1942 had been accompanied by a solemn vow: "I shall return." This pledge shaped both military planning and public expectations as the war progressed. For MacArthur, returning to the Philippines was not merely a military objective, it was a personal crusade and a matter of national honor. At the same time, strategic realities reinforced the importance of fulfilling this pledge. The Philippine archipelago occupied a central position along Japan's southern supply corridor, linking the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Borneo with the Japanese home islands. Control of the Philippines allowed Japan to protect these vital sea lanes, while its loss would cut the empire in two, isolating forward-deployed troops and depriving the home front of critical resources such as oil, rubber, and food. American naval planners, however, did not universally agree with MacArthur's insistence on returning to the Philippines. Within the upper echelons of the U.S. military leadership, particularly the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Navy's strategic planners, an alternative path was gaining traction. This route favored bypassing the Philippines entirely and instead striking directly toward Formosa, Taiwan, and the Chinese coast. Advocates of this approach argued that seizing Formosa would put the Allies closer to Japan while allowing them to support Chinese ground operations against the Japanese mainland. Such a move, they contended, would hasten the collapse of Japanese resistance without the risk of engaging the large Japanese forces stationed in the Philippines. The debate between the Philippines First and Formosa First camps was intense, with each side presenting compelling strategic arguments rooted in geography, logistics, and the broader vision of the war's endgame. Ultimately, President Franklin Roosevelt intervened personally to settle the dispute. In July 1944, during a high-level strategy conference in Hawaii, Roosevelt met with General MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Naval Forces. After hearing their positions, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur, concluding that the political and psychological importance of liberating the Philippines outweighed the potential benefits of bypassing them. This decision set the stage for one of the largest and most complex operations of the Pacific War. Codenamed Operation King II, the assault on Leyte would involve extensive coordination between air, land, and naval forces. It also marked the beginning of the end for the Imperial Japanese Navy, which would gamble nearly all of its remaining strength on the outcome of the ensuing battle. Japan recognized the significance of the impending American return to the Philippines. Within the Japanese High Command, there was widespread agreement that the loss of the archipelago would render the empire strategically unsustainable. Without access to the natural resources of Southeast Asia, Japan would be unable to fuel its navy, supply its armies, or sustain its industrial output. This grim reality led to the development of Shogo, or Operation Victory, a series of defensive plans aimed at countering Allied offensives. Shogo I, the most important of these, outlined a desperate and aggressive strategy to repel the American invasion of the Philippines. Rather than adopting a conservative defensive stance, the plan called for a complex, multi-pronged counteroffensive designed to lure American naval forces away from the landing zone and then annihilate them in detail. Though bold, the strategy reflected both Japan's lingering offensive spirit and the stark recognition that only a dramatic victory could alter the course of the war. The Japanese naval forces assigned to Shogo I were divided into several task groups, each with distinct roles. The center force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was the most powerful. It consisted of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, including the mighty Yamato and Musashi, two of the largest battleships ever built. These vessels boasted enormous firepower, but their effectiveness was hampered by shortages of experienced pilots, outdated reconnaissance capabilities, and the growing dominance of American carrier aviation. Meanwhile, the Northern Force, commanded by Jusaburo Uzawa, acted as a decoy. Comprised mostly of carriers with few aircraft, its purpose was not to fight effectively, but to draw the American fast carrier groups away from the landing beaches. The Southern Force, divided into two smaller formations led by Admirals Shima and Nishimura, was tasked with penetrating the narrow Surigao Strait and attacking the Allied invasion fleet from the south. Though meticulously planned, Shogo I faced enormous challenges from the outset. Japanese naval aviation, devastated in earlier battles, was a shadow of its former self. The carriers designated as decoys had so few operational aircraft that they could not mount any significant offensive action. Their value lay purely in their ability to appear threatening to American commanders. Moreover, the Japanese Navy was critically short on fuel. Several capital ships had to ration their fuel supplies to even reach the battlefield. These logistical constraints reflected Japan's declining industrial capacity and the overwhelming pressure exerted by the U.S. submarine campaign, which had inflicted catastrophic losses on Japanese merchant shipping. Nevertheless, the Japanese High Command remained determined to launch Shogo I, seeing it as the empire's last chance to achieve a decisive result. While Japan prepared for its last major naval engagement, the United States continued its relentless advance across the Pacific. The victories in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in mid-1944 provided the U.S. with air bases from which B-29 bombers could stripe the Japanese home islands. At the same time, the capture of key islands in the Palau Group and western New Guinea enabled the Allies to build staging areas for the impending assault on the Philippines. American naval superiority in the Pacific had become overwhelming. The U.S. Navy fielded dozens of aircraft carriers, hundreds of warships, and thousands of aircraft, supported by an industrial base capable of replacing losses with unprecedented speed. This industrial superiority, combined with the tactical flexibility of American commanders such as Admiral William F. Halsey and Admiral Raymond Spruance, ensured that the Allies could strike Japan with increasingly devastating force. Admiral Halsey, in particular, would play a pivotal role in the unfolding events around Leyte Gulf. Known for his aggressive command style and willingness to pursue bold offensive actions, Halsey commanded the U.S. Third Fleet, which included the powerful fast carrier task groups. These task groups formed the core of American naval striking power, capable of launching massive air attacks on Japanese ships, airfields, and ground installations. Halsey's aggressive temperament made him a natural fit for offensive operations, but it also introduced risks. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, his decisions, particularly regarding the pursuit of the Japanese decoy carrier force, would become a subject of debate among historians. Nevertheless, his leadership helped shape the dynamic and unpredictable nature of the battle. Operation King II marked the opening phase of the Allied campaign to liberate the Philippine archipelago, and it represented the culmination of months of intense planning, coordination, and strategic calculation. As the Allied fleet advanced toward Leyte Gulf, the air was thick with anticipation. More than 700 vessels of the U.S. Seventh Fleet crowded the seas, carrying the assault forces that would spearhead the return to the Philippines. The invasion was unprecedented in scale for the Southwest Pacific theater, rivaling the size and complexity of the Allied landings in the Marianas earlier that year. The strategic goal was clear: seize Leyte, establish a powerful beachhead, and prepare for operations across the broader Philippine archipelago. In doing so, the Allies would threaten Japanese control of vital sea routes and pave the way for the eventual liberation of Luzon, the largest and most politically significant island in the Philippines. The invasion force was composed of two principal assault corps: the X Corps, commanded by Major General Franklin Sibert, and the 24th Corps under Major General John Hodge. Together they formed the U.S. Sixth Army, led by Lieutenant General Walter Kruger. These units had fought across regions as diverse as New Guinea, Biak, and the Palau Islands, gaining experience in amphibious operations and jungle warfare. Their troops, seasoned by years of intense combat, understood the dangers awaiting them on Leyte's shores. Even so, the assault on Leyte posed unique challenges. The island's rugged terrain, dense forests, and expansive rice fields offered the Japanese defenders numerous opportunities for ambush, entrenchment, and delaying tactics. The American commanders were acutely aware that while initial landings might be lightly contested, the Japanese would likely reinforce the island quickly and fight tenaciously. In the days leading up to the landing, Allied air and naval forces launched intensive preparatory bombardments across the island. Carrier-based aircraft from the Third Fleet swept through the skies, targeting Japanese airfields, supply depots, troop concentrations, and coastal defenses. These strikes had a dual purpose: to weaken Japanese positions on Leyte and to neutralize enemy air power throughout the region. The reduction of Japanese airfields was particularly vital, as the success of the invasion depended on minimizing the risk posed by kamikaze sorties, conventional bombing runs, and torpedo attacks. Meanwhile, battleships and cruisers of the Seventh Fleet delivered sustained naval gunfire along the coast, softening resistance near the chosen landing zones. The combined weight of naval and aerial firepower left portions of Leyte smoldering, but it also signaled to the Japanese High Command that the Philippines would soon become the site of a major confrontation. Admiral Thomas Kinkade's 7th Fleet carried the bulk of the responsibility for the amphibious landings themselves. Kinkaid coordinated dozens of task groups, each with specific roles. Attack transports carried soldiers and supplies. Landing craft ferried troops ashore. Minesweepers cleared the approaches to Leyte Gulf, and escort carriers provided essential close air support. The operation required near-perfect synchronization. Minesweepers set to work early, navigating waters that were potentially littered with mines and underwater obstacles placed by the Japanese. Hydrographic surveys had identified suitable landing sites near the towns of Dulag, Palo, and Tacloban, where the beaches were broad and accessible. As the fleet drew nearer, anticipation among the troops grew, tempered by nervousness and the awareness that the Japanese defenders might be lying in wait. The rhythmic hum of engines, the roar of naval bombardment, and the steady movement of landing craft became the soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Japanese forces on Leyte were commanded by Lieutenant General Shigematsu Saito, although the overall defense of the Philippines fell under General Tomoyuki Yamashita. The Japanese had initially deployed relatively few troops on Leyte, as they believed the Allies would strike Luzon first. Yet they quickly recognized the strategic mistake once Allied bombardments made clear that Leyte was the true objective. The Japanese air and ground defenses were unprepared for the scale of the Allied onslaught. Many airfields had been destroyed, aircraft had been lost, and communication lines were fragmented. Reinforcing Leyte would be challenging due to the naval blockade and growing American air superiority. Still, the Japanese military had proven time and again that it would fight with ferocity regardless of the odds. Small pockets of defenders along the beaches prepared for the invasion, ready to resist or delay the advance of American troops wherever possible. On the morning of October 20, 1944, the final bombardment commenced as dawn broke over Leyte Gulf. Battleships such as USS Pennsylvania, USS West Virginia, and USS California unleashed devastating barrages against suspected Japanese positions. Columns of smoke rose from the coastline as cruisers joined the barrage, pounding enemy bunkers and defensive emplacements. Overhead, aircraft from escort carriers swept in to strafe Japanese strongpoints, destroy machine gun nests, and clear pathways for the incoming waves of landing craft. The ferocity of the bombardment shook the earth and echoed across the Gulf. The massive firepower was intended to neutralize enemy resistance before the first American troops set foot on the beaches. As the smoke began to lift, it revealed a coastline battered and scarred by hours of relentless assault. At 10 a.m., the first waves of American soldiers began their approach to the beaches. Amphibious tractors known as LVTs led the way, followed by arrays of landing craft filled with infantry. X-Corps advanced toward the beaches near Palo, while 24th Corps aimed for the Dulag area to the south. As the landing craft surged toward the shore, troops braced themselves for enemy fire that could erupt at any moment. Yet to the surprise of many, initial resistance was sporadic. The extensive bombardment had severely disrupted Japanese defensive lines, leaving many positions destroyed or abandoned. Some Japanese defenders attempted to fire on the landing craft, but American return fire and naval gunfire support quickly overwhelmed them. By midday, the beaches were firmly in American hands, and the process of unloading equipment, vehicles, and supplies was underway. General Douglas MacArthur arrived on the beach later that day in one of the war's most iconic moments. Wading ashore near Red Beach, accompanied by staff officers and photographers, he declared the liberation of the Philippines underway. His broadcast message, "People of the Philippines, I have returned," resonated deeply across the archipelago, providing hope to civilians who had endured more than 2 years of Japanese occupation. The symbolism of MacArthur's arrival was immense. For many Filipino civilians and soldiers, it signaled the beginning of the end of Japanese rule. For MacArthur, it was the fulfillment of a promise he had carried with him since his evacuation from Corregidor in 1942. Yet despite the celebratory atmosphere surrounding his arrival, the battle for Leyte was only beginning. The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea marked the dramatic opening phase of the naval engagements surrounding the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It unfolded on October 24, 1944, as the massive Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita attempted to force its way through the central Philippines and strike at the vulnerable American landing forces off Leyte. Kurita's fleet, one of the most powerful naval formations Japan had assembled since Midway, included battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in great number, spearheaded by the colossal Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever constructed. These leviathans symbolized the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy, each carrying 9 18.1-inch guns, armor plating several feet thick, and an imposing presence unmatched by any ship afloat. Yet despite their raw power, these ships were entering a domain increasingly dominated by American naval aviation. In the Sibuyan Sea, this shift in naval warfare, from battleship to carrier dominance, would be made undeniably evident. Vice Admiral Kurita's center force had already endured a harrowing ordeal before reaching the Sibuyan Sea. On October 23, the day before the battle, Kurita's flagship, Atago, and her sister ship, Maya, were struck and sunk by American submarines Darter and Dace in the Palawan Passage. Takao was severely damaged and forced to withdraw. Kurita himself barely escaped with his life, transferring to the battleship Yamato. The loss of these heavy cruisers not only reduced the firepower of center force, but also demonstrated that the Americans had penetrated Japanese naval movements far more deeply than anticipated. Despite these setbacks, Kurita pressed forward. His mission, under Operation Showdown, was crucial: push through the Sibuyan Sea, exit via the San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the 7th Fleet's escort carriers and invasion transports off Leyte. Failure to do so would render the Japanese overall counteroffensive plan ineffective. As dawn broke on October 24, American reconnaissance aircraft from the 3rd Fleet located Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea, approximately west of Leyte. The sighting reports swiftly reached Admiral William F. Halsey and the fast carrier task groups under his command. These carriers, organized into Task Force 38, represented the core of American naval striking power. Their aircraft were trained, experienced, and equipped with bomb and torpedo loads capable of sinking virtually any ship on the ocean. Among the carriers present were USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, and USS Franklin, each carrying dozens of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The moment Kurita was sighted, Halsey's carriers prepared to launch wave after wave of coordinated airstrikes intended to stop the Japanese advance before it reached the American beachhead at Leyte. Shortly before midday, the 1st American Strike Group reached Kurita's formation. The Japanese fleet, steaming in columns, presented large and highly visible targets. Musashi and Yamato, towering above the rest of the fleet, naturally became primary targets. The American pilots, fully aware of the importance of neutralizing these ships, pressed their attacks with precision. The skies erupted with anti-aircraft fire as Japanese gunners attempted to repel the incoming aircraft. Flak bursts dotted the sky, forming a deadly curtain intended to break up the formations of American bombers. Despite the intensity of the defensive fire, the American aviators pressed their attack with determination. Dive bombers plunged from high altitudes, releasing armor-piercing bombs that whistled downward toward the armored hulls of the Japanese battleships, while torpedo bombers swept in at low altitude, releasing their torpedoes in carefully timed spreads. Musashi bore the brunt of the first wave of attacks. Her immense size made her a tempting target, and the American pilots zeroed in on her with relentless accuracy. Torpedoes smashed into her port side, shaking the massive warship and causing her to list. Bombs slammed into her decks, punching through armor and igniting internal fires. Despite absorbing numerous hits, Musashi's crew fought valiantly to contain the damage. Damage control teams struggled to patch holes, counter-flood compartments to correct the list, and extinguish fires that threatened ammunition stores. Musashi's engines strained to maintain speed, but with each torpedo impact, her ability to maneuver diminished. Even with her legendary armor, Musashi could not withstand the cumulative punishment inflicted by the American air crews. While Musashi was being pounded, other ships of the center force also came under attack. Cruisers such as Tone, Chikuma, Myoko, and Haguro maneuvered aggressively to avoid bombs and torpedoes. Destroyers weaved through the formation, laying smoke screens in an attempt to obscure the larger vessels. Yamato, leading the formation, also came under attack, but sustained relatively light damage compared to her sister ship. The American pilots noted the effectiveness of the Japanese evasive maneuvers but remained determined to disrupt the fleet's advance. Their mission was not merely to damage the Japanese ships, it was to slow them, to weaken their ability to break through the San Bernardino Strait, and to prevent them from reaching the vulnerable invasion fleet at Leyte. Throughout the afternoon, successive waves of American airstrikes continued to hammer Kurita's fleet. Each assault inflicted additional damage on Musashi, gradually overwhelming her defensive capabilities. By early afternoon, she had sustained enough torpedo hits to severely compromise her buoyancy. Her list increased, and her speed dropped, making her even easier target. Kurita recognized that Musashi was in grave danger and ordered her to withdraw to the west, hoping to bring her to shallow waters where she might be beached to prevent sinking. The attempt came too late. A final series of airstrikes struck the battleship with devastating effect. Torpedoes ripped into her starboard side, bombs slammed through her decks, and the cumulative damage proved fatal. Musashi began to capsize slowly, her massive bulk rolling over as her crew continued their desperate efforts to save their ship. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Musashi slipped beneath the waves, taking more than 1,000 sailors with her. The Battle of Surigao Strait stands as one of the most historically significant engagements within the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. Fought during the night of October 24–25, 1944, it represented the final clash in naval history where battleships engaged one another in a traditional gun duel. This battle also showcased the matured tactical proficiency of the United States Navy, displaying its mastery of radar-directed fire, night operations, and layered defense strategies. Opposing them was Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Japanese Southern Force, a formation disadvantaged from the outset. Consisting of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Mogami and a small group of destroyers, Nishimura's force was tasked with forcing a passage through Surigao Strait and attacking the vulnerable U.S. landing forces at Leyte. However, the geography of the strait created a deadly bottleneck, one that the Americans exploited with devastating precision. Nishimura's situation was grim before he even entered the strait. Operation Showdown required 3 separate Japanese naval groups to converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously, but coordination between these forces proved nearly impossible under combat conditions. Vice Admiral Kiide Shima's 2nd Striking Force was intended to support Nishimura, but the two groups were separated by distance and timing. Nishimura pressed on ahead, driven by the urgency of the Japanese counterattack plan. He had already endured air attacks on October 24, which damaged some of his ships and reduced the effectiveness of his formation. Nevertheless, he sailed toward Surigao Strait that evening with resolve, knowing that his mission required breaking through an American gauntlet prepared specifically to defeat him. As night enveloped the narrow waters, Nishimura's ships advanced in a line-ahead formation, maintaining speed and silence as they entered the most dangerous stretch of their approach. Awaiting Nishimura was the U.S. 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid. Although Kinkaid commanded a different formation than Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet, he nonetheless possessed overwhelming firepower in the Surigao Strait area. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commander of the 7th Fleet's Bombardment and Fire Support Group, devised a textbook classic of naval ambush tactics. He positioned his battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and PT boats in layered defensive lines stretching across and along the strait. This arrangement created a kill zone of immense proportions. Oldendorf's plan was straightforward yet brilliant. His forces would engage the Japanese from multiple angles, using torpedo attacks, radar-directed gunfire, and crossfires to annihilate the enemy before they could even reach the transports in Leyte Gulf. In tactical terms, Oldendorf executed what has been described as the perfect naval ambush, an engagement often compared to the ancient Greek victory at Salamis for its effective use of geography. The first American units to engage Nishimura's force were the small and agile PT boats positioned along the outskirts of Surigao Strait. Though lightly armed, these boats played a crucial role by detecting the advancing Japanese ships and harassing them with torpedo attacks. Throughout the night, PT boats launched numerous torpedoes, forcing Nishimura's ships to maneuver and revealing their position to the rest of the American fleet. While the torpedoes caused limited damage, many missing or being evaded, their tactical value was immense. They disrupted the Japanese formation, forced the enemy to light up their guns to repel the boats, and provided vital intelligence to the cruisers and destroyers lying in wait farther north. The PT boats' tenacity also contributed to the destruction of several Japanese destroyers, making the already outnumbered Japanese force even more vulnerable. Further into the strait, American destroyers stood ready to deliver devastating torpedo attacks. These destroyers were positioned on both eastern and western flanks, preparing to hit Nishimura's ships as they advanced along the narrow passage. As the Japanese formation progressed, the destroyers launched coordinated torpedo spreads designed to intersect the enemy's line of advance. The results were swift and brutal. The battleship Fuso was struck by torpedoes that caused catastrophic internal damage. Burning fiercely, she eventually broke apart and sank, becoming one of the first major casualties of the battle. Other ships in the Japanese formation also suffered torpedo hits, reducing their speed and combat effectiveness. The American destroyer attacks demonstrated the deadly potential of well-coordinated torpedo tactics, especially when employed in confined waters where enemy ships had limited room to maneuver. As Nishimura's now wounded formation struggled forward, they approached the heart of Oldendorf's ambush, an imposing battle line of 6 U.S. battleships positioned across the northern mouth of the strait. These battleships included West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Mississippi. Several of these ships had been damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor and were subsequently rebuilt with modern radar and improved fire control systems. Their presence at Surigao Strait symbolized the resilience of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and its transformation since the war's early days. Under Oldendorf's command, these battleships waited in perfect alignment, prepared to deliver radar-guided broadsides at long range. For the last time in naval history, battleships would engage one another in a decisive clash of firepower. The decisive phase of the battle began when Nishimura's flagship Yamashiro, along with the cruiser Mogami and the destroyer Shigure, emerged from the darkness and came within range of the American battle line. Using radar-directed targeting, the U.S. battleships opened fire with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned naval officers. West Virginia fired first, unleashing a full broadside that illuminated the night sky. One by one, the other battleships joined in, their guns pounding Yamashiro with shells that tore through her armor and ignited devastating internal fires. Nishimura, aboard Yamashiro, maintained his course despite the overwhelming odds. He and his crew continued to fight with determination, returning fire even as their ship was being ripped apart. The American fire was so accurate and so concentrated that Yamashiro was soon mortally wounded. Within minutes, she began to list heavily, eventually capsizing and sinking with most of her crew. Meanwhile, Mogami struggled to survive in the face of overwhelming American firepower. Shells from cruisers and battleships slammed into her hull, causing fires and severe damage. The Battle off Samar stands as one of the most extraordinary and dramatic episodes in naval history. Fought on the morning of October 25, 1944, this engagement showcased the astonishing courage, determination, and improvisation of the United States Navy's Task Unit 77.4.3, better known as Taffy 3. This small group of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts found itself unexpectedly confronting the full might of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, which included battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. The mismatch in firepower was staggering. Kurita's fleet boasted some of the most heavily armed surface ships ever built, including the super battleship Yamato. Taffy 3, on the other hand, consisted of slow and lightly armored escort carriers and a handful of relatively small screening ships. Yet, despite overwhelming odds, Taffy 3 fought Kurita to a standstill, eventually compelling the Japanese admiral to withdraw. The battle would go down in legend as one of the greatest displays of naval heroism, illustrating how audacity and determination could turn the tide even against vastly superior forces. Under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, Taffy 3 began the morning much like any other. Its 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Callinan Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambier Bay, were conducting routine flight operations in support of the Leyte invasion. These carriers, though vital for providing close air support to ground forces, were never intended to engage enemy capital ships. They carried small aircraft complements, lacked armor, and could manage speeds no better than modest cruising rates. Supporting these carriers were a mere 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hole, and Harriman, along with 4 destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler. These screening ships were equipped primarily for anti-submarine warfare, not surface combat. Their torpedoes and 5-inch guns were effective, but only when used under favorable conditions. No one expected that these ships would soon face some of the most powerful warships afloat. At around 6:45 a.m., radar operators aboard Taffy 3 detected unidentified surface contacts approaching rapidly from the northwest. Moments later, lookouts reported massive columns of water erupting near the formation, salvos of large-caliber shells. The impossible was suddenly real. Kurita's center force had emerged from the San Bernardino Strait and was steaming directly toward the lightly defended escort carriers. Earlier assumptions that Kurita had retreated proved disastrously wrong. Instead, darkness had concealed his advance, and he had arrived at the very heart of the American defensive perimeter. Taffy 3 was alone in his path. Sprague grasped the gravity of the situation instantly. Without hesitation, he ordered his carriers to turn away at full speed while launching every available aircraft, even those armed only with machine guns or depth charges. The battle for survival had begun.
Kurita's fleet, having endured heavy bombing in the Sibuyan Sea but still formidable, now faced a target that exceeded his expectations. The sight of what appeared to be American fleet carriers and cruisers led him to believe he had encountered a major enemy force. In reality, he had stumbled upon the smallest and least powerful major U.S. naval unit in the region. Kurita immediately ordered his ships to pursue and engage. The colossal Yamato, the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, and numerous heavy cruisers including Chikuma, Tone, Suzuya, and Kumano, began closing the distance, firing salvos as they advanced. Their shells, some measuring 14 to 18 inches in diameter, dwarfed anything Taffy 3 could return. The escort carriers, with their thin hulls and slow speeds, were extremely vulnerable. Yet Sprague and his sailors responded with remarkable courage. Rather than accepting destruction, they prepared to fight back with every weapon at their disposal. The destroyers of Taffy 3 were the first to act decisively. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the USS Johnston took immediate initiative. Without waiting for explicit orders, he turned his destroyer toward the advancing Japanese fleet and charged at full speed into battle. Evans understood that the carriers would not escape unless someone bought them time. With unwavering resolve, he brought Johnston within firing range of the Japanese heavy cruisers. Her 5-inch guns roared to life, targeting Chikuma and other cruisers with rapid-fire salvos. Johnston's smokescreens and evasive maneuvers complicated Japanese targeting efforts. But Evans did not stop there. He launched a torpedo attack, targeting the heavy cruiser Kumano. The hit was devastating, blowing off Kumano's bow and forcing her out of the battle. This astonishing blow from a lone destroyer demonstrated the effectiveness of daring action and further convinced Kurita that he was fighting a much larger force. Inspired by Johnston's audacity, the destroyers Hull and Heermann also charged into the fray. Hull, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, launched torpedo attacks under intense fire. Though she suffered numerous shell hits almost immediately, Hull pressed forward with determination. Her crew battled damage, fires, and flooding while still attempting to strike the Japanese fleet with torpedoes. Heermann, meanwhile, found herself engaging several heavy cruisers simultaneously. She fired torpedoes that forced Yamato herself to take evasive action. The fact that the world's largest battleship was temporarily forced out of position by a lone destroyer speaks volumes about the tenacity of Taffy 3's screening ships. Heermann even exchanged gunfire with Kongo and Haruna, managing to avoid catastrophic damage through expert seamanship. The courage displayed by the crews of these destroyers would later become legendary. The final act of the Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded at Cape Engaño, where the Japanese Northern Force, under Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa, sought to lure the American Third Fleet away from the San Bernardino Strait. This chapter of the battle was defined not by the tactical brilliance of fleet maneuvering or the weight of battleship gunfire, but by deception, sacrifice, and the stark culmination of Japan's naval decline. Ozawa commanded what was essentially a decoy force, a carrier group in name, but one stripped of strength. His carriers were nearly empty of aircraft, their flight decks populated more by the memory of previous power than by actual planes. The Japanese High Command knew that only a grand diversion offered any hope of allowing their surface forces to break through and attack the Allied invasion fleet at Leyte. Thus, Ozawa sailed southward into danger, fully aware that he and his ships were intended as sacrificial bait in a desperate gamble. Admiral William F. Halsey, leading the powerful U.S. Third Fleet, had long sought the opportunity to destroy the remnants of the Japanese carrier force. Since the early months of the war, American naval planners viewed the sinking of Japan's carriers as essential to securing Allied victory in the Pacific. When Halsey received reports of Ozawa's carriers near Cape Engaño, he believed he had finally found the decisive battle he had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. Ozawa's force appeared to offer the perfect target. The carriers Zukaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, along with their escorts. What Halsey did not fully understand was that these carriers had virtually no offensive capability. They were hollow shells, stripped of aircraft, and serving as floating lures. Nonetheless, the sight of enemy carriers excited Halsey's aggressiveness. Determined to finish off what he saw as Japan's last true naval threat, he ordered his entire carrier striking force northward. Ozawa's northern force had begun its journey southward earlier in October, launching what few aircraft it possessed in a series of desperate raids that failed to inflict significant damage on the advancing American fleet. By the time Cape Engaño was reached, Ozawa commanded barely more than a handful of aircraft. His carriers were nearly defenseless. The Japanese sailors aboard these vessels were fully aware of their role in the larger strategy. They knew their chances of survival were minimal. Zukaku, the last remaining survivor of the 6 carriers that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, sailed into what many considered her final mission. Her decks, once bustling with pilots and aviation crews, were now quiet and largely empty. For many Japanese sailors, the operation carried a solemn sense of closure, as if the Imperial Navy itself had reached its final chapter. Halsey's decision to pursue Ozawa has remained one of the most debated actions of the battle. Critics argue that he should have left a portion of his force to guard the San Bernardino Strait, where Kurita's center force might reappear. Yet Halsey believed he had crippled Kurita decisively in the Sibuyan Sea the day prior. To him, Ozawa's carriers represented the last real threat to American naval dominance. Driven by the desire to strike the enemy's heart, he committed his entire fast carrier fleet to the chase. The Third Fleet surged forward with determination, its carriers launching wave after wave of aircraft. Unlike at Samar earlier that morning, these planes carried the full destructive potential of American naval aviation. Bombs, torpedoes, rockets, and machine guns, all meticulously prepared, were unleashed in overwhelming numbers. At dawn on October 25, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Ozawa's carriers. The northern force, exposed in the open sea, had nowhere to hide. Moments later, the first waves of American aircraft descended upon them. The skies filled with U.S. Navy dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, their numbers so great that Japanese observers could scarcely count them. Zukaku, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet, and the last Pearl Harbor veteran still afloat, became a primary target. Bombs slammed into her flight deck, tearing through the wooden structure and igniting fierce fires. Torpedoes struck her hull, causing flooding and listing. Despite heroic efforts by her crew, Zukaku's fate was sealed. At approximately 2 p.m., she capsized and sank amid thunderous explosions, taking hundreds of sailors with her. As she slipped beneath the waves, her crew performed their traditional final salute, chanting "Banzai" in a final act of loyalty to her ship and nation. Other Japanese carriers shared similar fates. The light carriers Chitose and Chiyoda were struck heavily during the early waves of American attacks. Chitose succumbed first, capsizing and sinking after devastating hits. Chiyoda was left burning and immobile, eventually being finished off by surface ships later in the day. Zuiho fought valiantly, despite lacking aircraft, and managed to survive multiple waves of airstrikes before finally capsizing under the relentless barrage. The destruction of the Japanese carrier force at Cape Engaño was nearly total. Not only were the carriers sunk, but many of their remaining destroyers and cruisers were heavily damaged or destroyed as they attempted to shield Ozawa's flagships from American attack. Amid this devastation, Ozawa displayed remarkable composure. Aware of the sacrificial nature of his mission, he made no attempts to flee prematurely. His role was to keep Halsey's forces occupied for as long as possible, drawing them away from the critical southern waters where Kurita Center Force had engaged Taffy III. He succeeded. For crucial hours, Halsey's Third Fleet was diverted far to the north, leaving an opening for Kurita to attempt a strike against the American landing fleet. Though Kurita ultimately withdrew from Samar, the delay caused by Halsey's northern pursuit shaped the course of the battle. Ozawa's willingness to lead a doomed fleet into action demonstrated a level of personal sacrifice characteristic of Japan's military philosophy during the late war. Even as Ozawa's force was being destroyed, the scale of American air power symbolized the decisive shift in naval warfare. The carrier, not the battleship, reigned supreme. American pilots reported little opposition in the air and only scattered anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ships. The near-total collapse of Japanese carrier aviation meant that the once-feared Imperial Navy no longer possessed the ability to challenge American naval supremacy. From this point forward, Japan would fight without a viable carrier arm, a limitation that ensured eventual defeat. The battle at Cape Engaño thus represented not only a tactical victory for the United States, but also the symbolic end of Japan's ability to wage modern naval war.